She was the celebrated wellness guru, a young, vibrant woman who claimed to have beaten terminal cancer through nothing but natural remedies.
Belle Gibson convinced the world she was a miracle. She claimed she was curing terminal brain cancer with natural food and healthy habits. She was a business owner with a famous app and a huge following. People saw her as a survivor who outsmarted her doctors. But her story had a problem. The facts did not match the image. When people began looking for evidence, they found a pattern of lies instead of a miracle. Before all of this, there wasn't much people could actually verify about her. She was born in Australia and had no strong public background in health or medicine, and instead of credentials. That lack of history didn't raise questions. It made her story easier to accept. But later on, it became one of the gaps people started to look at more closely. Her posts began to carry more weight and guidance, especially those dealing with illness could look at and think maybe there's another way. She shared a message that would define how people saw her, a simple statement, but that carried everything her story depended on.
I have been healing a severe and malignant brain cancer for the past few years with natural medicine, Gerson therapy, and foods. It is working for me.
That line positioned her as someone already on the other side of it, someone who had figured something out that others hadn't. Her followers grew rapidly. People didn't just watch her, they invested in her story, emotionally, personally, sometimes even desperately. Because what she was offering wasn't just content, it was hope framed as evidence. But what most people didn't see at the time was how structured that story really was. Whether intentional or not, it starts with something tragic that makes it personal enough that people can relate to it. Then introduce a turning point that separates you from everyone else. And finally, position yourself as someone who found a solution. Her platform reflected that shift. It wasn't just photos anymore, it was a lifestyle or a system. What started as posts turned into something more structured and intentional. She launched what would become the center of her brand, a wellness platform built around everything she had been sharing, all tied back to the same idea that healing could come from within, from what you eat, from how you live. It was called the Whole Pantry. It was being downloaded in large numbers, generating attention beyond her followers, reaching people who had never seen her story before but were drawn to the concept itself. A clean, simple, natural approach to health, backed by someone who appeared to be living proof. From the outside, it looked like growth. This wasn't just an influence anymore, but a business. And more importantly, this was a story that now had something to protect. So did the weight of what she represented. They were following a result, a living example of something they wanted to believe could be true, and that belief gave everything she touched more value. The Whole Pantry became an extension of her story. Every piece of advice carried the same underlying message. This is what helped me. This is what can help you, and that connection between personal story and product is what made it powerful. It also made it profitable. The app was downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, bringing in significant revenue early on. And what's important here isn't just the numbers, it's what those numbers represent. Because people weren't just buying a product, they were buying into a belief system. That belief system was expanding. Her presence moved beyond social media and into mainstream attention. Her name started appearing in places that don't usually take chances on unverified claims and platforms that typically rely on credibility. And somehow, she passed through those filters. A book deal followed, turning her digital presence into something tangible, something that could sit on shelves, something that carried authority simply by existing in that format. And again, it all traced back to the same foundation, her story. The original narrative was already strong, but over time, that wasn't enough to maintain the same level of attention. Because when a story is built on something extreme, it often has to become even more extreme to stay convincing. She started sharing updates that pushed the limits of what people could accept without questioning. New complications and new claims about her condition becoming more serious. even as she continued to present herself as someone managing it through the same method she had always promoted.
In 2009, Belle Gibson reported experiencing vision problems and difficulty walking. Soon after, she claimed she was given a terminal brain cancer diagnosis and given just 4 months to live.
I mean, in 2009 was a really bad year for you, wasn't it? You had 3 heart operations, you suffered 2 cardiac arrests, you died twice on the operating table, you had a stroke, and you were diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumour and given 4 months to live.
Correct. And
all that happened.
I still have the heart condition, and I was supposed to have surgery for that.
You were supposed to have surgery.
And I didn't.
I have cancer in my blood, spleen, brain, uterus, and liver. I wanted to respectfully let you each know, please don't carry my pain. I've got this.
She told her audience that the cancer had moved beyond its original form, that it was now affecting multiple parts of her body, not just the brain, but other organs as well. And instead of weakening her credibility, it seemed to strengthen her connection with her audience. The more difficult the situation appeared, more people admired her for handling it. Gradually, small inconsistencies began to surface. The details didn't fully align, timelines that seemed unclear, explanations that shifted slightly depending on when or where they were told. Some people noticed that her medical explanations didn't always make sense. Those certain claims lacked the kind of detail you would expect from something so serious, filled with specifics that sounded convincing but didn't lead to anything verifiable. People who had seen parts of her life that didn't match what she was presenting publicly started asking questions not to accuse but to understand. And eventually they reached someone who knew how to turn questions into something else. It started much smaller, with a quiet message from someone who had been close enough to see a different side of Belle Gibson. That discomfort turned into a decision to speak up. The claim itself was direct and difficult to ignore. She's faking cancer.
It is. And
Except you didn't have brain cancer.
No, I didn't.
No.
But when I was writing that, I thought that I did, and I was feeling well.
Yes, but even then you misrepresented what you thought was your truth, which was all a big lie anyway.
I'm really sorry. And it hurts me, and I beat myself up every day for how I have hurt those who mean a lot to me.
Journalists who were used to stepping back from emotion and focusing on what could actually be proven, people who understand that even the most convincing narratives begin to break when you start asking precise questions. They approached it carefully, going through her posts, everything she had shared publicly. Some parts lacked detail, while the inconsistencies became harder to ignore, especially for something as serious as a terminal illness where clarity usually matters most. Still, inconsistency alone wasn't enough to confirm anything, because doubt only raises questions, and what they needed was something that could be checked. That's when the focus shifted away from the illness itself and toward something more concrete: the money. Belle Gibson had been openly claiming that a portion of her earnings from her app and her brand was being donated to various charities.
At first, like there always was with Belle Gibson, there was a huge outpouring of support for her. But then things turned and people started asking why she hadn't donated money raised for charity and how charitable donations get mixed up in a business's cash flow. And what then happened within, I guess, an hour or so was what we had expected. And that was that people would start openly questioning her cancer diagnosis and her claims of eating healthily and beating metastasized terminal brain cancer. Other publications then jumped on the story, and it really opened the door for us to publish on the doubts that we'd already heard about from her friends and from doctors.
It was part of the image she had built, reinforcing the idea that she's also giving back to others facing similar struggles. So the journalists followed that thread in the simplest way possible. They contacted the charities she had mentioned, expecting to confirm what had already been publicly stated. But what they found didn't require interpretation or debate. The money wasn't there. The donations she had spoken about either didn't exist at all or were significantly smaller than what had been claimed. and that discovery changed the direction of everything. What made the situation harder to ignore was what started to come into focus once people looked at the numbers more closely. It has already generated real money. Over a relatively short period, her app alone had brought in hundreds of thousands. Her book deal added another 6 figures on top of that. And when those figures are placed next to the promises that had been made about donations, the gap becomes difficult to explain. The image she had presented was consistent, but once those claims were checked against what could actually be verified, that image began to lose its foundation. The situation moved beyond public opinion and more formal, that had required the claims to be examined under a different standard on what could be proven. And what made that moment stand out was how it unfolded. Because when the case moved forward, she didn't take part in the process that was meant to evaluate everything she had said and done. So instead of hearing directly from her, much of what was examined came from what already existed, her posts, even the statements she had made publicly, and that created a situation where the focus shifted away from who said she was, and toward what could actually be confirmed through evidence. The claims fell into 2 clear areas: what she said about her health and what she said about the money. They were presented as facts, but statements people were meant to trust. Which brings the situation back to a question that doesn't have an easy answer, because when someone builds a story, especially one that can't always be immediately verified, it becomes difficult to separate what is genuinely believed from what is being used for something else. The story was moved into something that could be proven wrong, and once that information became public, the reaction shifted almost immediately. People who had followed her and defended her began asking the same questions all at once. If the money wasn't real, then what else had been misrepresented? The tone around her changed in a way that was hard to reverse. Messages of support were replaced by questions. Those questions turned into accusations, and for the first time, the same story that had built her reputation began to work against her. As more people looked closer and medical professionals began to weigh in, explaining that the kind of recovery she had described, and especially without conventional treatment, wasn't just rare, it was extremely unlikely, with one expert describing it as something on the level of 1 in 100 million. And once a story reaches that point, it stops being something people want to believe and becomes something people feel the need to verify. Everything around her started to fall apart at the same time. Her publisher acted quickly, pulling her book from circulation and distancing themselves from the claims associated with it. Companies that had once supported her began stepping back without explanation, and the environment that had once amplified her story became noticeably quiet. In the middle of that shift, she did what often happens when pressure builds faster than a response can be controlled. She stepped away, leaving behind a gap filled with speculation and growing scrutiny, until eventually a decision was made that would change how everything was seen moving forward. She would speak through an interview, one that would place her directly in front of questions she couldn't avoid, one that would require her to explain everything in real time, and that interview was with 60 Minutes.
She was the celebrated wellness guru, a young, vibrant woman who claimed to have beaten terminal cancer through nothing but natural remedies.
By then, the story had already begun to unravel. But what hadn't been fully seen yet was how it would hold up when every part of it was examined directly, without the structure she had relied on before or reshape her narrative after the fact. Because this time, every answer had to exist in the moment. And that alone changes how a story behaves under pressure. But because they were direct and repeated when the answers didn't align, which slowly removed the space she had previously used to move around details. Early in the interview, she was asked plainly whether she was prepared to tell the truth, and her response came quickly.
So just for clarification, are you prepared to sign a statutory declaration to say that everything you tell me today is the truth?
Absolutely. There's nothing left to lose, and if that requires a stat deck, then I'm comfortable with that.
A statement that sounds certain on its own, but certainty only works when it's supported by consistency. And that consistency never fully settles as the conversation continues. As the question moves forward, the details that once seemed fixed began to shift again. Timelines become less stable. Explanations start leaning away from verifiable facts. Interpretations can change depending on perspective, while facts are expected to remain the same.
But today, she has yet another reason for why she walked away from cancer medication.
Very soon after I'd started this treatment here in Melbourne, I fell pregnant, and that was a huge catalyst for me.
In what way?
Because I thought, well, if I'm undergoing chemotherapy, then I don't want that to affect my pregnancy.
Oh, so you stopped the chemotherapy because you were pregnant?
I stopped the chemotherapy for various reasons. I didn't know.
Truth, Bill, truth.
Tara, I'm trying to draw on information.
No, don't draw on information. Just be honest.
I am being
Please be
honest with you.
When she's asked about the treatments she had previously claimed to undergo, chemotherapy and radiotherapy, the answers don't confirm those claims in a straightforward way. That she believed she was receiving those treatments, and that shift creates a contradiction that stands out, because earlier, those same treatments had been presented as definite experiences, not as something uncertain or misunderstood. The focus moves toward how she was diagnosed, which should be one of the most concrete parts of any medical history. The explanation leads to something unstable, involving a person without a confirmed professional record, methods that don't match standard medical practices, and descriptions that seem to change depending on how the question is framed.
He had come to my home and went through a series of tests, and this was dubbed integrative medicine.
So he comes to your home and he does some tests on you?
He does.
What sort of tests?
It was a box, a machine with lights on the front, and that machine was apparently German technology. There's two metal pads, one that goes below the chair and one that goes behind your back, and then that measures what I believe or remember to be frequencies.
And what were the results?
He said to me that I had a stage 4 brain tumour and that I had approximately 4 months to live.
There is a moment where the interviewer directly points out that the version of the story being told in the interview does not match what had previously been shared publicly.
Why did you write in the foreword of your book that you got this information in your doctor's office, that you got this prognosis in your doctor's office?
Because I think that being open and telling people the way that it happened would not be understood, and that people would be disappointed or angry for me, not following what is the right way to go about this.
That's what people had read and believed is not consistent with what is now being explained. The responses expanded further because the story is not being clarified, it's being altered again, and that repeated adjustment becomes one of the clearest signals throughout the entire exchange because of how often those answers need to be reworked. As the interview progresses, even the most basic details begin to reflect the same instability, and when she is asked something as simple as her age, the response is not fixed.
You're 23, right? Well, actually, how old are you?
I've always been raised as being currently a 26-year-old.
How old are you?
Well, I live knowing, as I've always known, that I would be 26.
Okay, Bill.
This
This is a really, really simple question. How old are you?
I believe that I'm 26.
And?
I have two birth certificates and I've had my name changed 4 times. The identity crisis there is big.
A statement that stands out because of what it implies, that even something as straightforward as your age is being framed as belief rather than certainty. From that point on, the tone of the interview does not need to become more aggressive or confrontational, because the contradictions are already visible on their own. They only need to be observed, and that's what makes this moment different from everything that came before it. People are no longer reading a version of her story that has been shaped and presented in a controlled way. They're watching it unfold in real time. The way answers change depending on the pressure of the question, and that kind of exposure operates differently. It allows the audience to come to their own conclusion without needing interpretation. Once that happens, the belief that once supported her narrative begins to weaken. The focus shifts away from how inspiring the story sounds and toward whether it can actually hold up under direct questioning. By the end of the interview, there is no single moment that definitively closes the story. No final statement that resolves everything, because the exposure comes from every inconsistency and every explanation that does not align with the one before it. The conclusion becomes clear without needing to be stated directly. It doesn't just reveal that the story was false, it shows what happens when a story that has been carefully controlled is placed into an environment where it can no longer be adjusted before being seen, where it has to exist as it is. The truth does not need to be forced into view. It becomes visible on its own, and that is what this moment represents. This was the point where everything became clear. This is why. So subscribe or Belle Gibson will try to convince you she's still 26.